Alrighty then, let's move on to step 6, writing your introduction. So when you write your introduction, you want to start with your hook. People tend to overthink this. Don't overthink this. You don't have to have a particularly clever hook. You don't have to introduce the topic of depression, for example. Just set up the text and the context. Use your introduction to show that you have understanding of the text as a whole. Just keep it simple. Then, of course, we have the thesis. Now, it's very important that you refer back to this thesis regularly throughout your essay, and it has to be crystal clear in the introduction so that the person reading, the examiner, knows what your entire essay is about. And finally, you have your plan. Now, my advice to you is don't use the first person pronoun and don't use self-explanatory phrases. So, for example, do not say, in this essay, I will. Now, this might be right for other subjects, but in English, this is usually frowned upon. We want to have texts that are more academic in nature, that are more objective in nature, or at least appear more objective. So, let's go and have a look at how we are going to write our introduction. So the hook, we're going to talk about audience, we're going to talk about purpose, we're going to talk about content, and we are going to talk about theme. Then, of course, you have your thesis, and our thesis, let me remind you, was in this comic strip, both text and image work together in order to encourage and reassure the reader. And our plan, our first argument is going to have to do with how colours reinforce the message of the text. The second paragraph will focus on characters' facial expressions and body language. And thirdly, on individual panels and their individual messages. Also, you're going to need to know who wrote this text and what the title of this text is. And the text type would be useful as well. When you're writing a paper 1, all that information is usually included. So if you go to the bottom of the text, you will find, of course, the guiding question. And that guiding question will almost always tell you what the text type is. There will also be information on who the author is. In this case, it is Gale Galligan. And if the text does not have a title, so articles, for example, will have a clear title. Comic strips do not always have a clear title. That title will be included at the end as well. Can do. Occasionally, you have different titles, and that is because the text was originally published somewhere else and given a different title. For example, online newspapers sometimes change the titles of their articles if there have been complaints. But you just pick one and run with it. Do not confuse the textual information, the end of the text, for actual content. It's not, it's just there so that you know where this text came from. So, the introduction. I'm not going to make you watch me write the introduction because it's just going to be a lot of silent typing and erasing and things. I've already written my introduction and here it is. So, the introduction. The Can-Do comic strip, written and illustrated by Gale Galligan, aims to communicate a message of hope to her audience. Galligan targets readers who may be feeling stressed and overworked, reminding them of the importance of self-recognition and self-care. Throughout this comic, text and image are combined in order to encourage and reassure the reader. This is particularly visible through the author's use of colour, through the characters' facial expressions and body language, and through the messages communicated in individual panels. So, this is my introduction. Let's split it up into parts so that you can see how I wrote it. Now, I went back, I edited, I crossed things out. Well, it's a computer, so I just erased it. But don't be afraid to go back and change things. So, for example, audience, I changed to readers in this second sentence so that it wouldn't be repetitive. So here we have the hook, here we have our thesis, and here we have our plan. Let's start with the hook. So, the Can-Do comic strip, written and illustrated by Gale Galligan. So here we have the title, we have the genre, and we have the author. Aims to communicate a message of hope to her audience. And here we have purpose, but also theme. The theme is hope. Galligan targets readers who may be feeling stressed and overworked. This is the explanation of the audience, reminding them of the importance of self-recognition and self-care. Again, this has to do with content, but it can also be connected to purpose. Now, you will notice that I say Galligan. I use the author's surname. Do not use the author's first name unless you are saying it with their surname, Gale Galligan, for example, because they are not your friend, you are not intimately connected with them, and this is in academic texts. I see this a lot in literary essays where people will say Jane instead of Jane Austen, or William instead of William Shakespeare. Call them Austen, call them Shakespeare. Do not call them by their first name. You'll also see how I have a range of different sentence types. We have subordinate clauses and we have independent clauses. It's good to have a variety of sentence types in your writing to make it better. Then we have the thesis. I actually altered my thesis a bit. You are allowed to do this, absolutely. Just make sure that it means the same thing, more or less. And I did this because I thought it sounded better with throughout this comic, rather than in this comic. Then we have the plan. Remember, I advised you not to start off with, in this essay I will. You can use phrases such as, this is particularly visible through, for example. And that sets up the plan. So part 1, the author's use of colour. Characters' facial expressions is part 2. And messages communicated in individual panels is part 3. There are other phrases that you can use. So, for example, you could use the phrase, not only is this particularly evident through the author's use of colour, but it is also clearly a part of the character's facial expressions. Things like that. So, that was the introduction. And we are now going to move on to the body paragraphs.